that's still with us, all of which now plays into this latest crisis of the outbreak of COVID-19 and the associated lockdowns. And it's important to not separate those two. The lockdown is very much part of the crisis. It's the part that people will really feel, other than those who are actually directly affected by the illness itself. And it's the one that's most likely over time to prompt the kind of delayed changes to reality that we've seen in past crises. So I want to start out with a very kind of top level where I think we are in terms of the United States and China. I mean, most of what we're going to follow here will be filtered through the relationship between the US and China, the growing rivalry. We've been in a transition from a kind of strategic cooperation with a lot of mutual interests in terms of T-bonds and trade to a very, very pointed strategic rivalry bordering on, at this point, hostility. It's very close to that. I don't know where that line, where you cross that line, it may be, shots fired in the South China Sea. Let's hope not. But we are at a very interesting inflection point, and COVID-19 vastly it raises the stakes in terms of what is possible in a downward sense on the state of the relationship, but also it opens the possibility for an awful lot of mischief from both sides, mischaracterizations of each other's actions, and accidentally stumbling into problems by misjudging the reactions or likely reactions of the other. So let's talk at a high level first, and then I want to get very specific about defense. First of all, the U.S. inability to kind of competently deal with this outbreak, I think, has stunned the world. The debate inside the United States is an echo chamber. Everything is being, especially because this is an election year here, everything is being couched in political analysis of how well or how poorly the White House has reacted to this. I think the more important takeaway for the world is that the United States system, a federalist democracy, reacted poorly, continues to be dysfunctional. I was talking to someone, a client, a couple of weeks ago, and it's as though we've declared war, but then the president has turned to the various states and said, fight it if you want to, raise your own armies, decide on whether you need gas masks and whether you need weapons. And there has been very little central coordination. And I think if you look across the world, some of the most severely affected countries in the world have a kind of federalist or diffused system of government. And so Spain and Italy are excellent examples of this, where regional authorities played a very leading role in the response, with the national authorities laying back quite a bit at the beginning. And these are each the United States, Italy, Spain. We're in the top 5 of per capita deaths per million in COVID. So I don't think the United States has arrested the slide in global influence that it has been experiencing roughly since the Iraq War became clearly a disaster. And I think that, if anything, that has accelerated. And that's going to have implications for business, for the way the United States calculates its defense posture, whether it's going to be forward-based, whether it's going to be focused on strategic or tactical capabilities. And I think it's going to hurt the United States in terms of setting a global agenda. In many ways, we have not come off as a leader. And in fact, the United States has not even put itself forward as a leader in a global sense. It's been very focused on the area within its borders and dealing with the outbreak locally. I think the Fed may be the great exception to that. The Fed continues to be a leader globally. It has effectively bailed out much of the world economy by fiat. I mean, ultimately, its remit is the U.S. economy, but it has a very open and kind of small L liberal definition of what U.S. interests are, and that includes obviously having the world's economy survive this as well. So let's talk about what's happening specifically in the U.S.-China relationship and how that relationship is going to manifest itself in terms of defense posture and spending in both countries. I think the beginning of that conversation should be that we went into this crisis in very poor shape in terms of bilateral relations. The kind of difficulties the Obama administration had with China were largely diplomatic and occasionally strategic military issues, for instance, cyber war, et cetera. The Trump administration took office at a time when it became clear that even a Democrat had Hillary won in 2016, that trade relations were going to become a major issue because of the upsurge in basically the populist backlash against the purest forms of globalization. I believe what you're seeing now, we've had now full 3 years of the Trump administration's very, tariff focused and black and white calculus on what U.S.-China trade is all about. We have come to the point where that is a real problem. The United States now is in the very beginnings of the real presidential election year. The China issue is cropping up on several fronts in the United States that will make it difficult to have rational, kind of measurable conversations about what the value of the relationship is. So, for instance, already some Republicans are casting the likely Democratic nominee Joe Biden as a friend of China, as pro-Beijing. Similarly, the administration seems quite divided over whether or not right now it wants to ink a big trade deal with China, even though that was a real priority before COVID-19. And of course, most importantly, you're seeing the rising rhetoric going back and forth between China and the United States. Much of it could be characterized as propaganda over whose fault this is, over whether there were deliberate efforts to discourage the United States from taking urgent steps early on that would have, obviously saved enormous amounts of national treasure, and then just an ugly kind of back and forth over whether China is ultimately deliberately trying to take the United States down, and similarly from China's side, where the United States is trying to scapegoat China in what is a global pandemic. So, at a very high level, if you think about the old Cold War utopian dream that some force from Mars would attack Earth and it would precipitate all the world's powers to kind of join together and fight the Martian invasion. That's what COVID is. And boy, did we not join together. We've done exactly the opposite. The threat from without has actually divided further those with the most capacity to fight this. And that's a sad macro point. So what does it mean militarily? There's been in the past week a good deal of coverage of China's nighttime exercises out off the Taiwanese coast. I think you could read too much into that as there have been some questions about whether this is the, wag the dog moment. China goes in and invades Taiwan while we're busy self-isolating. I don't see it that way. I think China is doing what it always does. It's provoking and putting the marker down that it regards this as its territory and will do whatever it wants in that region. The U.S. has responded, as it has often, with a transit of a warship twice now through the Taiwan Strait in the last month. The problem is U.S. capacity to actually counter an invasion of Taiwan has deteriorated enormously in the past 10 to 15 years. Part of that is the fact that we spent the first decade of the 20th century uh, building a military that was not going to be useful for the rest of the century, essentially a counterinsurgency, heavily armored land-based military for the Iraq War, which ultimately is not really that relevant for the strategic challenges that we now face in the Pacific. Um, the other problem, though, is that advances, as many of you will know, in the hypersonic missile realm, in certain aspects of submarine warfare, particularly very quiet diesel submarines, and in area denial capabilities on the part of the Chinese, and often fueled by developments in the Russian defense industry, have made the traditional concept of how the United States would respond to a crisis, either in Taiwan or in the South China Sea, look more and more obsolete and untenable. US carriers, now the last one, the Gerald Ford, I think clocked in over $15 billion. Still not quite out through its trials yet, but ultimately, that's an awfully expensive asset to be putting in the sights of hypersonic missiles and quiet diesel submarines, which have demonstrated the ability to sneak up on US task forces. So to the extent that our response to any crisis like that is based on the carrier strike force, we're in some trouble. And that trouble has not been acknowledged by US defense planners. It has echoes of the post World War I period, when the battleship was the queen of the seas, and battleship commanders made sure it stayed that way right until Pearl Harbor proved that it was obsolete. I think that ultimately we are seeing a period which will require a transition to new weapons platforms, particularly in maritime warfare, but also in the air. And that is just not happening quickly enough. There are too many vested interests, both within the services in terms of an ideological sense and out there in industry. After all, these are very, very lucrative contracts, and they're not short-term contracts. You don't build an aircraft carrier in a year. It's a very long-term investment for any contractor to embark on the construction of these carriers. And the last thing they want to see is these contracts canceled, even if ultimately, strategically, that makes sense. I think from the Chinese side, we're also seeing this play out in a really interesting way. The Chinese, in some ways, the construction of their own aircraft carrier is really more of great power bling than anything strategically significant. It's as with U.S. carriers, it's highly vulnerable now in any serious battlefield environment. It has been dismissed as a target ship by the U.S. Navy for years. Maybe that's fair, but the reality is it is an indication of ambition, at least. The other question here for the Chinese is the extent to which they are now developing an almost formal alliance with Russia. Over the last 3 years in particular, we've seen new steps in that direction, both in the energy markets, China becoming a very important player with Russia in terms of Russian energy supplying its needs, but also now, and of course, they were largely aligned in the Syria conflict, though China kept its head down mostly. But the sale of Su-35 fighters and S-400 missiles, and which I would imagine eventually turns into S-500 anti-aircraft missiles sold to China, is an indication that Russia is back as a top-line supplier of China's military. The pattern for the last 15 years or so has been that China would basically reverse engineer anything the Russians created and produce it domestically. But I thought I saw that Su-35 sale as a pretty significant milestone in seeing these two move more and more and more toward a formal alliance that is inevitably going to be counter to U.S. interests. So how now does the U.S. come out of the COVID crisis moment and readjust to the realities that COVID has brought to bear? I think the first thing we have to recognize is that, like most of the world's questions, the United States and other countries will come out of COVID-19, whenever that is, whether it's autumn or next year, in a financially weakened position. In particular, for the sovereign, for the United States, GDP, I think the latest figures I saw were 106%, just taking into account what has already been appropriated in terms of relief and stimulus by the US Congress. That's massive. So the United States comes out of this severely crimped. I also believe that the United States comes out of this with at least some portion of the national security um, community aware that they have misdefined what it is to defend a nation. If, for instance, you cannot react logically or competently to a problem like COVID-19, do you not raise the question for the nuclear proliferators of the world is, well, why do that? Why not just develop a biological capability? After all, and apologies to my good friends in Baltimore, but if North Korea had destroyed Baltimore with a nuclear weapon, the entire U.S. economy would have been shaken, but it would not have stopped. So this is a pretty amazing demonstration of the power of biological weapons, something that is easy to take for granted, and something that frankly got very distorted and then downplayed after the missteps of the Iraq invasion, where WMD was, obviously the motive for the invasion. I think that poor defense forces that pre-COVID, because inevitably crunch in spending is going to raise all sorts of questions. I'm talking about misallocation and some of the more recent initiatives that rode the explosion of defense spending that came into office with Donald Trump. I have a hard time believing that the full nuclear modernization plan, which is quite expensive, and talks with the Russians and others, as planned. It's very expensive, and it will be looking like a luxury, I think, to the Congress once this pandemic plays out. Similarly, I think the Space Force, I know it excites the little boy and everybody, but it seems awfully silly right now, given what we're facing here on Earth in a biological sense. The other things I think that are at risk, again, I think there'll be another round of questioning over large warships. The Navy has obviously announced recently that it's going to retire the cruiser force on time rather than bring them in for expensive upgrades and life extension. That may be logical, but the bigger question is surface fleets generally. Are they becoming just impossible to protect and thus not that effective in the modern environment? The other pretty obvious thing is the extent to which the Army and its new tactical vehicles programs will survive. I think there's a real question about the Joint Light Tactical Vehicle. Similarly, for the Air Force, there are some serious questions about the value of stealth technology now. This may be the great stranded asset of the early 21st century in defense terms. There are radars now which can at least theoretically unmask a stealth weapon. I've tried to do some calculations on what the US has spent on stealth since the late Cold War. It comes somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 trillion. Similarly, you can add another $1 trillion of nuclear ballistic missile defense to that. All of these are programs that I hope will be scrutinized, frankly, and whose future viability is being challenged by changes in technology and changes in the nature of what we need to defend ourselves from. So I wanted to, before I drone on further, I wanted to leave it there. Hopefully I've been a slightly provocative speaker, and Bilal can pull some more insight out of me.
Mike, thank you so much for that very insightful discussion and really the breadth of what you covered. I want to shift tact a little bit and talk more squarely about some of the changes that COVID-19 is likely to bring about. And so, in line with that, I wanted to kick off and get your thoughts on biosafety. The Wuhan lab theory, which is now well known, albeit unsubstantiated, is now doing the rounds, especially among the White House, who are emphasizing this is the origins of the outbreak. It's also been referred to as those looking at this from the outside as the White House sort of conclusion shopping. But that being said, there are many scientists now, much more than before, and biologists who are hunting for bat viruses. And we know that there's been an increase in the BSL-4 type sites that we found in Wuhan that can hold the world's most dangerous pathogens. So there could well be an environment, especially after the pandemic, where there is increasing risk of laboratory-derived pandemics or laboratory-derived security risks. And so what is your take or view looking forward on not just the US, but other countries' defense departments and even corporate actors that can get ahead of these biosafety issues by way of innovation or other mechanisms, which clearly could become a part of our broader security architecture?
So I think there's a really interesting analogy here to the nuclear weapons industry. And following the Cold War, actually in the late Cold War beginning, and then toward the end, toward the period right after the Berlin Wall fell, there was a real focus on nuclear safety, nuclear security, in the non-strategic sense. Rather, the idea that the dissolution of the huge Soviet nuclear weapons program could lead to the movement of that IP or the movement of actual nuclear materials across borders. And so there was a fairly sustained effort in the early 2000s to try to secure nuclear weapons sites in a way that would be verifiable, that would be jointly agreed across nuclear countries, so that we don't have heists, obviously, or we don't have the classic Russian scientists moving to country X to build their nuclear weapons for them. I think in the biological sense, there's a much greater opportunity to do this, and particularly because it is much more focused in a non-military scientific community. So it's important when we talk about the Wuhan lab, and I often see this in news stories, it was not a weapons lab. It's really important to make that distinction. There are weapons labs. The Wuhan lab was a top-level biological research laboratory. So those, as you said, Bilal, they exist all over the world. The WHO, which is now under attack for a variety of things, one useful function it could play would be to coordinate and agreed protocols on how those labs should conduct themselves, a reporting system that, and possibly even an inspections system that checks those labs now and then and certifies them as up to date, certifies their practices, certifies the knowledge of those who work there. So those are the kinds of things I can see in an international architecture sense. From an industry standpoint, though, I think this is a really interesting question. This is happening at a moment when commercial real estate, whether you're talking about laboratories and hospitals or office buildings and factories, they are coming to terms with the fact that they can now know how their buildings are performing in a much more granular way than they used to. Ultimately, this is largely due to Internet of Things or IoT sensor data that can provide everything from what your air quality is to whether a door is open to whether there is a failure in a key refrigeration unit. All sorts of data on the occupancy of the building, the wellness of the occupants, And I think that kind of technology applied to some of these laboratories could raise the ability to monitor what's going on in them, both on site for the managers of those facilities individually, and then internationally, in that that could be part of a system of monitoring that allows us to understand where problems are kind of gestating before they explode.
I think that's a really interesting take, and I'm particularly drawn towards the points that you've made around the corporate sector, Internet of Things factor that you talked about, because I think there is going to be a nexus between informational asymmetries, how we protect actual physical infrastructure and capabilities, but also the sort of cyber side of it. And so that brings me directly to the issue of 5G. Right, so the U.S. Has for a while now been encouraged by some quarters to take a stronger role in setting the international agenda for 5G networks, or risk losing the international markets to China, which, among other things, could undercut U.S. national security. That was a big part of national security debates last year. Uh, Question number one is, I guess, what happens now in moving forward, given that we're talking about two players uh, that are certainly going to be ratcheting up and trying to navigate this pandemic over the next certainly 12 to 18 months. Washington has been faltering due to a lack of coherent policy on a wide swath of foundational issues to do with spectrum management for 5G usage, network supply chain security, infrastructure development, and data sharing. China hasn't been encumbered by these same factors. And so, do you see, especially in Europe, where the economic slowdown could really push them into China's corner when it comes to making the Internet of Things and 5G infrastructure a real
Ground very much in China's favor in terms of the 5G debate. I think that, if you pull back from the U.S.-China rhetoric and the national security issues and look at this, let's say in 2012, if we were doing this in 2012, this would be a question of who could do it most efficiently. It is essentially the plumbing. It's the people who come out and lay the cable for your cable TV service. This is not something that big U.S. tech is salivating over. The fact that they are being, essentially projected as the must-have solution for Western democracy for national security purposes runs in the face of their economic interest. I don't think they really want to go around the world and create 5G. I think they would have been very happy to let Huawei do it. And then to piggyback off of that and enjoy the profits that come from it being the value add property. Apple is perfectly happy having half the iPhones and iPods of the world created in China and then sell them and take all the margin here, right? So I think we are trying to do this in the face of a lot of economic tailwinds. The other thing I think that is true right now is that we're in a period, though, where I used to do quite a bit of consulting around CFIUS, the Treasury Department's kind of strategic assessment unit that decides whether or not an investment from a foreign country into a U.S. company is going to somehow compromise U.S. national security. CFIUS, I predicted in 2015, was about to become hyper politicized, and it has, right? The last big deal that CFIUS let go through was, ironically, Smithfield Hams being purchased by a big Chinese company. And now Smithfield is the center of a COVID outbreak. And you can imagine the ridiculous conspiracy theories around that one. But ultimately, I think that's the last of the big ones. We're in a place now where CFIUS is going to be used as a battering ram against any attempt to obtain U.S. technology through traditional mergers and acquisition. And it's also going to increasingly expand into the arena of browbeating U.S. allies into avoiding uptake on Chinese and other technologies that the U.S. regards as somehow compromising. You could also see this play out in terms of defense cooperation and the ability of the United States and its NATO allies to exchange weapons systems. So the U.S. has just signed an enormous contract for what is essentially an Italian frigate to eventually get the 355 ship navy afloat. Whether we ever get to that number or not is uncertain, but a lot of them will be these kind of Italian DNA. In and of itself disqualify them from engaging in the U.S. defense industry. I wonder about that, and I could see it going that way if Donald Trump wins a second term. Now, again, we got to come back to politics. Remember, this is an election year. Biden is being put in a bad position with regard to China. He may very well, I think he would probably be a little less concerned about the 5G threat than Trump, but now with the rhetoric that and the way he's being portrayed, he's going to have to seem just as concerned with it for political reasons. So I think we're going to see a balkanization of 5G, capabilities around the world, and I can't see the United States in the long run winning that particular battle.
Can I push you on that? Why not?
Cost. I just don't think the United States, we're going to be able to supply this at the same, efficiency in terms of the cost of these networks as Huawei will, because Huawei will be subsidized by the Chinese government one way or another. Similarly, I don't think the U.S. has the leverage it once had with allies in terms of defense spending, in terms of just global leadership chops to rally them behind this solution, and it's already a patchwork. The European NATO members are very lukewarm about this question, and I don't see this becoming a cause célèbre for NATO, or certainly for countries like India or Brazil and other medium powers in the near future.
Sorry, I was on mute there. I'm cognizant of jumping into the questions that we're receiving, and they're streaming in. But one final one from me, which has, I guess, been top of mind over the last few days, and was reminded about it by a colleague this morning, is what's going on between the US and Saudi Arabia right now. A few days ago, the US confirmed plans to remove 2 Patriot air missile defense batteries from Saudi Arabia. There was some talk that this would be a reduction in the buildup of US forces against the backdrop of Saudi-Iran tensions. And that was quickly quashed by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who said that this was a normal rotation and not part of any attempt to influence the Saudis on oil production. Now, given a lot of your work has been on geostrategy and geopolitics, if we bring the very clear political economy of defense into this, which has been driving both the supply and demand side of the US's industrial side, but also its R&D, and Saudi Arabia in terms of its buildup over the last few years, should we be worried?
I think this was a deliberate effort to influence the Saudis with regard to their oil production. I think, with all due respect to Mike Pompeo, he's being a diplomat there, and diplomats don't have to show their cards all the time. I think that there's a real concern about U.S. fracking as an industry. The Saudis and the Russians have been quite interested in undermining it for years. They've never managed to do it. They may not this time, but I think the U.S. was trying to show some displeasure at the drift of Saudi policy. On the other hand, it's worth noting that Patriot missiles managed to completely miss these Scuds that were launched by Houthi rebels to hit the most important oil terminal in the world. So you have to wonder about the value of them in the first place. So I think this is very symbolic. I think it has everything to do with the oil markets. And I don't think it's meant to be a long-term thing. I think this is shot across the Saudi bow.
Let's dive in to the questions. There's a really interesting one here that's come through, which I think speaks to several facets of your discussion here today, Mike. Which is, will China keep pushing ahead with their Belt and Road Initiative, despite the economic shocks that the global economy has felt? And to what capacity can they gain influence, given their own fiscal concerns?
It's a great question. It's one I'm actually working on right now. My sense is yes, absolutely. This is the time for the rising power, who are much more likely to experience a V-shaped recovery than any Western country, to double down. Capital markets are frozen in many of these developing nations. Access to investment and loans is a big issue for all of them. China is there to back them up. They will take advantage of this in that kind of macroeconomic sense to get commitments on Belt and Road projects, to do it at very, very, very low interest rates for themselves, and then they can decide what the interest rate is for their partners. And as we've seen, very often when distressed assets, if you want to look at the assets of some of these developed countries that way right now, come onto the market, China is going to drive a hard bargain, and one which may very well end up with default and the asset essentially in the control of a Chinese state run or very closely aligned company. So this is a great time from a strategic standpoint for the Chinese to do this. And it's also a great time for them to renegotiate some of the things they've done that hasn't quite have panned out. They've got a lot of leverage right now in the global economy. Their economy was hurt, but it was not flattened. It remained a regional issue in China. For whatever reason, they never felt the need to lock the whole country down. And because of their linchpin status in global trade and the movement of goods around the world, they really felt they couldn't. And this is often where a one-party state has some advantages. They don't have to put the interests of their people above commerce and then face an electorate in 4 years. That's not the case in the United States. There's a lot of different calculations going on, and in other countries where the leadership has to eventually go to the polls and face voters. So the Chinese were able to leverage those factors, and I think they'll use this crisis to expand rather than to pull back on the Belt and Road Initiative.
Thank you for that, Mike. I think your point there about the recovery differentiation between emerging and developed markets is an interesting one, and sort of harkens back to what happened after the financial crisis last time. But I think, given that the Belt and Road Initiative is intimately linked to certainly that string of pearls set of locations in emerging markets, I think that's going to be an interesting one to see. Looking at it just from an infrastructure point of view is not enough if these countries are willing to do business, especially in an economic downturn. I think you're right. China could end up getting to the initiative much more quickly and perhaps even cheaply. This is a very interesting question that's coming in, because I think it speaks to certainly a divergence from my read of what a Democratic administration would have looked like under Hillary Clinton. And so this could be a certain pivot amongst the domestic politics in the US, certainly. And that is, you'd mentioned that Biden is being put forth as a friend of China. And the question coming in is, how does the possibility of a Biden administration impact the period from now to inauguration day with respect to the administration's willingness to deal with China? And what does a Biden administration's posture towards China look like?
So I'll start this with a little anecdote. I spent the last month before the 2016 election delivering analysis in Shanghai and Hong Kong and Beijing to mostly expats, but also Chinese experts when I was still with Control Risks. Like everybody else, I thought Hillary Clinton would win. The polls suggested it. And Trump's victory was built on one-time phenomenon, which is the kind of surge of anger post 2008 that drove a populist wave. I think that you're going to see, interestingly though, the Chinese experts I spoke to, including some that were connected to the Chinese Communist Party, felt that they really wanted to see Donald Trump win. They didn't want Hillary Clinton. They were afraid of her. She had made herself a real thorn in their side as Secretary of State. And they tend to like the kind of transactional nature of Republican presidents more than the Democratic side, because the Democrats are more likely to focus on human rights, labor rights, environmental issues, things that China does not want to have a conversation about on other people's terms. They like to project themselves as the defender of rational climate policy, for instance. But if someone comes in and challenges them, they have to have that conversation in front of their own people, and they don't like it. So to get to the question specifically, I think this administration is increasingly going to be incentivized to vilify China between now and the election. The trade deal that is pending right now is already at risk because of internal dissent within the administration over whether they can be seen to blame China for the COVID virus and the economic shutdown that followed, and at the same time sign a deal with China on trade, which has its benefits for the United States, but which then creates a complex message on China from the Trump administration. And God knows there's one thing they don't like in this administration, it's complex messages. I think more, if you look toward a second term of Trump, they'll sign that in a minute. They want to get back to business. They want to see if they can pull something, do as well as possible to reinvigorate the U.S. economy, which has taken an enormous beating since the COVID outbreak. If Biden wins, though, I think that what you will see is a gradual shift toward a more global, globalist view of China, a move back toward the conversation being about the trade balance, not as a bad thing, but rather as a complex indication of mutual interests. I think that tensions would naturally lower because at this point, regardless of whether they wanted Hillary or Trump in 2016, I think there's some buyer's remorse in China in terms of trade, openings of areas of the Chinese economy. Unfortunately, none of this may ever come to fruition because COVID has locked down the U.S. economy and basically squashed trade. And no American firm right now is very bullish on its prospects in the Chinese market because of the political environment. And thirdly, because it's quite possible Donald Trump doesn't make it to a second term and Biden gets to reassess all this. So I do think there's a real question about, whether we'll ever see the fruits of this trade, long, difficult trade dance come to bear.
Thank you, Mike. I think one signal might be the fact that the whole pivot to Asia narrative really was birthed under the Obama administration, and VP Biden's proximity to that framework may be instructive of how he manages to deal with Asia as a whole, which is a good segue into our next question, which has just come in, which is the following. The security architecture in East Asia relies heavily on US support and local partners' capacity. Seeing that the US may not be able to sustain their military posture or investments in the region, and that states like Japan may not be able to carry the weight by themselves, should we be worried about a strategic realignment in East Asia if the crisis is as crippling as it could be for the US? What does that mean for China-Japan relations long term?
I think we are seeing a strategic realignment in Asia based not on what officials say publicly, but based on, if you look at the wargaming that's being done, for instance, at the U.S. Naval War College or at RAND over potential conflicts with China, even if they're very limited conflicts, the capacity to react, as I discussed earlier, is just not there anymore. The reality is that the main lever of U.S. hard power in Asia, which is the Seventh Fleet, is very constrained now because of the development of hypersonic missiles and other things. So already you're seeing, under Abe, the Japanese take defense much more seriously. They were already an underrated defense power. They've got a bunch of so-called helicopter frigates that are actually aircraft carriers. They, I believe, have always had a kind of plug-and-play nuclear capability. If they wanted to build a nuclear weapon, it would happen in about 2 weeks. Obviously, that's a gigantic taboo there, but it's one that's been broached in the past decade or so in response to Chinese saber rattling. My guess is that Japan will be able to retain a relationship with the United States that provides a deterrent to anything drastic. I think that other countries in the region are, for instance, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia to some extent, are inevitably being drawn further and further into the orbit of China. Mostly the leading edge of that wedge is economic, as the United States has fallen from the top position to sometimes third and fourth now as a trade partner with these nations. It's natural that they start to look to accommodate the source of their economic prosperity, and that source now is not the United States. But there's also the question of whether they could trust the United States to come to their aid. Each of them, in their own way, have over the years aligned themselves with U.S. power. Vietnam more subtly, the Philippines once very, very strongly, and they probably look back 20 years and think, I don't know what we've gotten out of this. I don't know that we feel any more secure or that we can stand up for our interests in this region with any greater degree of confidence because the United States says it's behind us. I don't know, it goes back to the old saw. Would the United States go to war over Brussels? The small countries in Europe worried about that during the Cold War. The countries of Southeast Asia worry about the same thing.
Well, let's flip that on its head a little bit. There's a question around here around how the virus could end up killing globalization, and all over the world there are cries from countries to strengthen internal production and manufacturing. So, to the point that we're talking about consolidation in East Asia and the overarching influence of China, could there also be an impact where more countries end up creating independent supply chains going forward? And certainly countries like Vietnam and the Philippines may see this as an opportunity to actually break away from the back and forth between the rock and the hard place of the US on one side and China on the other.
I tend to think that economic interests will predominate there, and interests driven mostly by corporations. There will be a reassessment of certain supply chains, certainly the medical supply chain. If you take the US as an example, there was outrage that the French and the Chinese at various points in the crisis forbade US companies who were producing N95 masks from exporting them to the US. Frankly, I think the United States would have done exactly the same thing to the French and the Chinese had the situation been reversed. Regardless, there is obviously a need to think in an industrial strategy way about certain types of things that we need. You saw not long ago, I think it was only 2 weeks ago, the Pentagon moved to take control of a rare earths mine in California, which is economically unviable, but that's not why they're interested in it. They're interested because, God forbid, trans-Pacific supply chains freeze up, then rare earths, which are vital to electronics and technology, will just dry up. And we've seen that the Chinese have no problem using it as a strategic weapon, as they did with the Japanese when there was a kind of dust up in the East China Sea a couple of years ago. So I think what you will see is certain, in almost like industrial policy decisions made around strategic assets. I think there's going to be an interesting debate about this in terms of whether things like fracked gas are included in that, because clearly, it too is very vulnerable to supply chains. Could we be seeing the beginnings of a deteriorating, petroleum and energy generally is a globally priced commodity? Could we be seeing that start to unravel? Maybe, but I think it's more going to be about countries looking at what they absolutely need to get through a crisis, and not necessarily autarky of the kind that you saw after sanctions were hit Russia. I think some countries are going to be that way anyway, but I think economics is going to drive this, and economic efficiency suggests that you're going to want to continue to have global supply chains.
Thank you, Mike. Mike, I hope you can stay a couple of minutes longer because we're getting a flurry of really good questions coming in, and I would love to get your thoughts on them. The first one is sort of speaks to your brief discussion earlier when we were talking about the US vis-a-vis the Middle East. And so a question has come in that how will Iran fit into the US-China and US-Russia relations? Do China and Russia have a stake in what goes on and happens to Iran? Will they sell Iran conventional weapons when the JCPOA embargo ends this October? I think that's a very valuable question that touches upon the third player in this matrix that you mentioned earlier, which is Russia. So it'd be great to get your thoughts there.
My sense is that both China and Russia were very unhappy, obviously, with the deterioration of JCPOA, as were many European countries that were, eager to see if they could get into the Iranian market, which has a lot of things going for it, including one of the world's youngest, well-educated populations. Having said that, I think that it's much more likely that the Chinese would enter the Iranian weapons market right now than the Russians. I think the Russians are going to try to use this period, in particularly if it looks as though the U.S. is going to elect a Democratic president, to try to position itself to get sanctions relief. We forget, but only 3 or 4 years ago, its invasion of Ukraine and the sanctions that followed were a worthy topic of discussion around the world. The Russians are still under those sanctions. I think they're probably going to tread a little more carefully. The Chinese have every reason to go in and to offer weapons to Iran at this point. They are eager for markets, and it's an opportunity perhaps for them to displace what had traditionally been a Russian market.
Speaking of the Russians, there's a question here about informational warfare campaigns and informational asymmetries, which I think applies to China too. And the specific question is, can you comment on Chinese use of information warfare techniques, including the suspected sending of millions of messages into the US that Washington was about to declare martial law in March?
So these reports, poorly sourced, that blame the Chinese for this, it's quite possible. It is classic disinformation. That both the Chinese and Russian systems of government are designed in such a way that it is completely deniable by the sovereign, and who can point to a proxy, either a sympathetic group in Ukraine, pro-Russian group in Ukraine, or possibly from the Chinese side, some rogue actor within the Chinese military that was doing this. So on a diplomatic level, I think they'll defray and not obviously accept responsibility. And that's one of the great challenges of cyber war, is it's very difficult to prove. In terms of whether they would want to do such a thing, absolutely. Why not and the United States is guilty of this in many ways, in many countries too. Why not test your ability to generate a conversation in a democracy during an election year, right? That is not ethical. It's not in the interest of the United States or in democracy in any way, but none of those things are in China's constitution, not in a believable way. So they're acting out of national interest. They are trying to see whether they can replicate the success that the Russian programs in the 2016 had. And it may be that this was mischievous, and it was deliberately mischievous, so that it would seem almost impossible that the Chinese government itself did this. It looks much more like some smart kid because of the way it was, because of the message it was sending that there's going to be martial law. Ultimately, though, that does go right to a cleavage in U.S. society between those who think the worst of the Trump presidency and those who think that he's doing things right. And so it makes sense that you try to, if you're gonna try to, clear a path for something, you look for the fissures to put the explosives in. And I think that's exactly what that was.
Mike, we have other questions, but I think for the sake of both our audience and your time, we'll end it right there. Thank you so much for joining us and providing such an insightful talk. We're very grateful that you